The ascension and triumphal return of Christ has been compared to that of a wedding ritual. In effect, we are being informed that the events surrounding Christ's round-trip journey will have the same outcome of that of a wedding, but not just any wedding, rather a Jewish wedding that Israelis living in the first century would be familiar with. Shalom, my name is Guy Smith, and this is the 19th video in this channel as the days of Noah. In this video, we're going to begin the process of determining the message being conveyed in the parable of the wedding of the Lamb. We will begin by examining Jewish weddings of the first century and compare this ancient marriage ritual with events described in the prophetic scriptures. Jewish weddings of the first century were quite different from modern weddings. To begin with, marriages were arranged and began with a contract, usually between the parents of two children. With the signing of the agreement, the children would be officially married. All that remained to fulfill the contract was the ceremony. Another difference is that unlike today's weddings, first century weddings were outdoor, parade-like, round-trip public displays, which can best be viewed as a four-step process. The day of the wedding would begin with final preparations of the banquet, which usually took place at the parents' home of the groom. The ritual itself would begin with the bridegroom departing from the banquet area in a round-trip journey en route to receive the bride, which would be in waiting at her parents' house. With the bridegroom's arrival, the bride's parents would give their daughter to the groom, thus fulfilling their part of the marriage contract. After receiving the bride, the couple would start back to the groom's home and the festivities. While en route, the bride and the groom would be joined by the bride's virgin girlfriends, which are equivalent to today's bridesmaids. After being joined by the virgins, the entire procession would complete the round-trip journey by proceeding to where the bridegroom began, to join the invited guests which will have gathered at the marriage banquet. This is a Jewish wedding ritual of the first century. Regardless of cultural differences, most wedding ceremonies have four groups of participants: the bridegroom, the bride, the virgin bridesmaids, and the invited guests. The prophetic scriptures also identify the participants of these four groups. Christ identifies himself as the bridegroom. John identifies the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven as the bride of Christ. The girlfriends of the bride weren't called bridesmaids in the first century. Rather, they were identified as virgins. And, according to John, the role of the virgins in this wedding parable is fulfilled by the 144,000 and the daughters of Zion, which will be in Jerusalem at that time. The invited guests of the bridegroom are represented by the disciples and those believers which are in the first resurrection. Now that we've identified the participants of this future event, let's compare the four-step process of a Jewish wedding of the first century with what the prophetic scriptures say about Christ's ascension into heaven. As previously discussed, a first century wedding would begin with the bridegroom departing from the banquet area in a round-trip journey to receive the bride. Likewise, Christ ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives. And, as previously stated in video 18, the purpose of Christ's ascension was to prepare a place for us within the Father's house, which is the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. With the arrival of the bridegroom, the bride's parents would fulfill their contractual obligation by giving their daughter to the groom. The couple would then start back to the wedding banquet. According to Scripture, it is predicted that after receiving the Father's house, Christ began his return trip. The receiving of the bride is the halfway point of Christ's round-trip journey. The rebirth of the nation of Israel is one of the many signs which indicates that Christ is about to finish the second leg of his journey. This being the case, then Christ received the bride and then began his trip back to the Mount of Olives approximately 1,000 years ago. Part of the ritual of the first century wedding was that the bride and the groom would be joined by the virgin bridesmaids while en route back to the marriage banquet. Which brings us to the parable of the 10 virgins. According to the parable, only half of the 10 virgins are prepared. And as circumstances would have it, only the half that are prepared will join Christ and enter the kingdom. After being joined by the virgins during the first century, the entire procession would complete the round-trip journey where the bridegroom began by proceeding into the marriage banquet to join the gathered guests. Likewise, Christ is predicted to conclude his round-trip journey where he began by setting foot back on the Mount of Olives. In review, the parable of the wedding of the Lamb is a description of the events involving the ascension and return of Christ, and will have a similar outcome to that of a Jewish wedding of the first century, where Christ, in the role of a bridegroom, ascended from the Mount of Olives into heaven to receive the tabernacle of God, which is the bride. And during his return trip, Christ will be joined by the 144,000 and the daughters of Zion, which represent the virgin bridesmaids. At that point, Christ will conclude his round-trip journey where he began, by setting foot on the Mount of Olives. This is the gospel of the kingdom according to Christ. More information can be found on thewhitestonechronicle.com.